waiting to be interviewed for a job as a wireless operator, a group of applicants paid little attention to the sound of dots and dashes that were coming on the loudspeaker. Suddenly, one of them rushed into the office, and he came back smiling, saying, "I got it." And the rest of them asked, "How did you get ahead of us?" And he said to them, "You might have been considered too if you were not so busy talking that you did not listen to the coded message that the manager sent on the loudspeaker." You see, the first one, it said, "The first one who interprets this and comes directly into my private office will be hired." So as he listened to that Morse code, he was figuring out what it said, and he went into the office and he got hired. You see, everybody in that candidate list was waiting, but only one was truly watching. The title of our sermon today is "Watch Therefore." And we're going to see what God has to tell us from the parable of the 10 virgins. And we look at this parable. It's a very famous parable, apparently in the medieval ages, because there was a lot of things happening around the world. There was wars, there was not, there were diseases and things like that. And people really had to look forward to something. And this parable was apparently very famous. You would find that in medieval architecture in Europe, especially for decoration of doorways and carved figures representing them in many of the churches and cathedrals. In fact, this picture was taken from the cathedral in Freiburg, where Pastor JP and Jemimaka, they lived for a while. And apparently this is representing the virgins that were waiting in this parable. But it isn't any popular anymore nowadays, and we're going to see why. And it ends with a grave warning from Jesus saying, "Watch therefore, for you do not know neither the day nor the hour." So we have to ask, why did Jesus share this parable? What is the lesson from the parable? And what does it mean to watch? Okay, but we have to set a little bit of context before we go into the parable to understand it better. You see, in Matthew chapter 23, we start there. Jesus was, it was his last week on planet Earth. He knew that he was going to go, he was going to be arrested, he was going to suffer, and he was going to die. So he starts telling the disciples about all these things. And in chapter 23, he looks at the scribes and Pharisees that were in the synagogue and in the temple, and he starts condemning them because of the hypocrisy that they had. And in the end, Jesus also shares a very emotional lament about the city of Jerusalem. In chapter 23, verse 37 to 38, Jesus says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it, how often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing." Verse 38, "See, your house is left to you desolate." Jesus was predicting the events of the future. He was actually predicting that this temple that they were watching or looking was going to be destroyed in AD 70. And the word desolate for the Jews, it brought pictures back for them from the time that they were exiled. Enemy kings had come, they had taken them captive, and they took them to their own land, and their cities were in rubble, right, destroyed. This was shocking for the disciples. This was a big deal for the Jews. That was the place God would meet with them. If there was no temple, unfortunately, it also means that God was not going to be among them. So as you can imagine, the disciples were a little bit shaken. And so in chapter 24, they start to show Jesus the buildings of the temple. Maybe he didn't see it properly. Chapter 24, verses 1 to 2, Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. And he answered them, "You see all these, do you not? I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. You see the difference? The disciples were seeing how grand, how awesome, how big these temples were. And Jesus is saying, not one stone will be left upon another. This was shocking. That's what they were expecting Jesus to do. They thought, hey, we've been following this Messiah. He's going to establish his kingdom. He's going to be king. Some of us are going to be ministers. But their assumptions were completely shattered. It became clear to them that they had no clue. So, at the end of the day, as Jesus, he was going to rest in another town called Bethany, and he was making his way east, there was a mount, and that was called the Mount of Olives. And this was a place on the way where you could turn back and you could see the entire city of Jerusalem. And Jesus took a break, and as he was looking, his disciples came to him and they said, Jesus, what's going on? Right? Not exactly like that, but they asked for three things. They said, Jesus, can you tell us when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming? And what will be the sign of the end of the age? Because that's what Jesus had been talking to them about. They wanted to know when the temple would be destroyed, and when will Jesus come back and execute judgment on the earth and establish his kingdom. The one kingdom that he has been talking all along. If you follow the book of Matthew, Jesus talks about one thing, that is the gospel of this kingdom of heaven, right? And what will be the signs of that times? We all want to know when, don't we? Most of you, if you're parents and if you're driving on the freeway, the one question that is always asked, when will we get there, right? But I think Jesus tells them this parable to tell them, it's not for you to know the time. In fact, I'm not going to tell you the time because even I don't know the time. But I'm going to give you something that you can take with you. So Jesus starts a long discourse, and this one is famously called the Olivet Discourse from the Mount of Olives. And he shares with them of the signs that they have to watch for, some examples from the Old Testament that they can immediately relate. He tells them a few parables that will drive the point home. And finally, he talks to them about the final judgment. So that's the context of this parable. So the parable that is in front of us illustrates to us one point, and that Jesus was teaching his disciple about the kingdom of heaven. So in Matthew 24, verse 36, Jesus says, "But concerning that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only." And in verse 42, "Therefore stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming." And in the parable, Jesus uses the picture of a wedding to illustrate that truth. The word "stay awake" that he uses in chapter 24 and the word that he uses for "watch" in this parable, they're the same. As soon as you hear this parable that Subha read for us, you might be immediately asking, who are these characters? Who is this bridegroom? Who are these virgins that were foolish and that were wise? And as a kid, I honestly had a question. So are all 10 of them going to marry the bridegroom? I hope I'm not the only one. I don't know if anybody else wondered, but that was me. So let me unpack the parable for us so we can know what the message is. Matthew chapter 25, 1-4. "Then the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. For when the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them. But the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps." So to start with, we have to understand a little bit about the Jewish wedding ceremony to be able to make sense of this parable. If you are thinking, I've been to weddings. We've done weddings in India. I'm able to understand this. I don't think you will have a clue. Because in the Indian wedding, you don't have to be present when the groom is there or the bride is there. I was part of a wedding earlier this year, and we were worried about one person, whether they will make it to the wedding. But thankfully, that person did. So if you're coming with that mindset, you're not going to, be able to understand. But in a Jewish wedding, what you have to understand is that it was the single most, greatest social event for that whole community in that time and in that place. It was a special time of festivity and happiness. But the Jewish wedding also happened in two phases. First, the wedding would be arranged by the parents or somebody, who's elderly. And once that happened, the bride and the groom, they had a ceremony. And it was actually half of the wedding already, because it was a ceremony with promises, covenant promises. And the groom would tell the bride that he was going to marry her and that he was going to go prepare a place. So after that, he would go back to his house, and he would either do an addition to his father's house, or he probably would build another house. And once that is done, he would send word that he was going to come and pick up his bride. And on a certain date, he will take with him some of the groomsmen with him, and they go to the bride's house, where he will be met by the bride and also some of her friends, the bridesmaids. And these bridesmaids were usually younger women who were virgins, and that's where we get the word virgin from. And they had a part to play in the wedding. And no, they're not going to marry the groom. They're just part of the wedding ceremony. It was customary in those times that these virgins would actually carry lamps with them, so that at night, as they were going back to the groom's house, and by the way, this happened usually in the evenings and nights, they would light up the evening sky. And it was a joyous occasion. They would sing and they would dance and they would go and celebrate in the groom's house. So once they arrived at the groom's house, they would all go in. And after watching for a certain time, the door would be shut. Now everybody was in the ceremony, and the doors are shut. They do not like to be disturbed. Now is the time for feast. Okay, so that is a little bit about the Jewish wedding, and that will help us understand some of the predicaments and the drama that's happening in this parable. So we are told in the parable that a wedding was happening, and the bridegroom was going to come. And there were 10 virgins who went out to meet him. Now, why 10, right? In the Jewish culture, some scholars believe that number 10 was probably a very special number for them. During the feast of Passover, to have the Pascha supper, apparently they needed 10 people. In order to constitute or form a synagogue, they needed 10 people. So 10 could be just a whole number or a complete number or a proper number for them, but we don't know exactly why Jesus uses the number 10. But what is more interesting is that a large number of them, half of them, were considered to be foolish, and half of them were considered to be wise. Why foolish and why wise? Verse 3-4 gives us a clue. But the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. Now, again, we're talking about a culture that was 2,000 years ago, and as scholars, they reviewed the archaeology and they reviewed literature. Some are divided about what the lamp means. Some believe that it could be a small piece of pottery where it had a small compartment for a little bit of oil and a wick that was coming out, and it needed to be replenished so that you can light it up. Some others believe that it was a torch. It was a stick, and there was a rag on top, and you needed to pour oil for it to have torch. And some have debated, hey, virgins can't carry these big torches. So regardless of what the device that they used, one thing is clear: they needed extra oil. And the wise had it with them, and the foolish did not. Now the story takes an interesting turn. In verse 5-6, the bridegroom is said to be delayed. They all became drowsy and slept, but at midnight there was a cry, "Here is the bridegroom, come out to meet him." we're told that the bridegroom got delayed. This was not common in those days. Now, especially if the ceremony was in the evening, and the groom and the bride, they've been waiting, those of you who got married, you can understand the anticipation, right? You would expect them to arrive a little early because they had to go back and, they have to have the feast. And so this was not common. This was interesting twist to the story. And by the time it was midnight, probably nobody was expecting him to show up that day anymore. Right? But at midnight, suddenly there was a cry, and at that point, the wise virgins got up, trimmed their lamps, and we see that the foolish virgins also tried to wake up and trim their lamps, but they found out something. They found out that their lamps were going off. They were going out. Either they did not have enough oil, and it completely drained by the time they were waiting, or maybe they did not have anything at all. But as it dawns on these foolish virgins that they don't have this oil, they scramble in the last minute somehow to light their lamps. And if they don't have this lamp lighted, they wouldn't be allowed in the wedding. And so they go to this wise virgins and they ask him, hey, can you give us some of your oil? Verses 8 to 9, and the foolish said to the wise, give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out. But the wise answered, saying, since there will not be enough for us and for you, go rather to the dealers and buy for yourselves. Wasn't that mean? I thought about this when I was a kid again. Isn't sharing caring? That's what I tell my kids. No, not so in this parable. You see, Jesus is not talking about us sharing and caring for one another. He's making an important point. Whatever the oil was, it was only sufficient for one. It was not transferable. The wise just could not give it to the foolish because there wasn't enough for two. So as they scrambled, they were advised to go hurry up, to go to the dealers to get some oil, and they actually ended up going, and they completely missed the procession, and they missed out the party. Verse 10 says, and while they were going to buy, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the marriage feast, and the door was shut. And in desperation, they make a last-ditch effort. They go to the house of the bridegroom, verse 11. Afterward, the other virgins came also, saying, Lord, Lord, open to us. But he answered, truly I say to you, I do not know you. You see, when a man, or when we use a name twice in the New Testament, it usually referred to an endearment of the other person. When Jesus was talking with Mary and Martha, he would call her Martha, Martha, right? He knew her. When Jesus was talking to Simon, in the Last Supper, he would say, Simon, Simon, I'm praying for you. Satan is asking to sift you. So they tried that too. They came and they said, don't you remember us? We are the friends of the bride. You invited us for the wedding. But the reply came back, I do not know you. What dramatic words. You see, the virgins needed a lighted lamp as a sign of their invitation. And the foolish ones, they did not have it. Then Jesus concluded the parable by giving them a stark warning. Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour. What a sad ending, right? So as we look back at the parable, we ask, who was the bridegroom? And Jesus had told many parables to his disciples, and in them he had told them about wedding feasts. But in this context, it was absolutely clear for them, based on the context of what he was telling them, that he was the bridegroom who was to come. He prophetically tells them that he would die on the cross. He would also predict the events that were to follow, that is the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and that he would come back one day, But by using this parable, he's telling them there is going to be a delay. Maybe you're assuming all these things will go fast. I know you're curious. I know you want me to establish my kingdom, but I'm going to delay it. And he tells them, it's not for you to know the time. Not even the angels, nor even he himself, but only the Father knew. Next thing is, who are the virgins? It was obvious to the disciples that Jesus was referring to people who say that they followed him. We see earlier in Matthew chapter 7, in the Sermon on the Mount, that many would come to Jesus. These are people, not ordinary people. These are people who would come to him and they would say, we prophesied in your name. We actually cast out demons in your name. We did mighty works in your name. So these are not some, people in the background, people who are not visible. These were people who are actually doing stuff. And Jesus tells them when they come to him, he would say, I do not know you. And what was the difference between the wise and foolish virgins? The main difference between the wise and foolish virgins is the fact that the wise were prepared. Both of these groups were waiting, but only the wise were truly watching. They are the ones who are ready. They are the ones listening to the dots and dashes on the loudspeaker. You see, the virgins had all the time in the world to get ready. When they all met together, the foolish saw the wise. They saw them have an extra flask of oil. They had an opportunity. When the bridegroom got delayed, and as they were thinking, oh, my lamp is going to go out, they had an opportunity. When they became drowsy and were about to sleep, if they really, really needed and wanted to be in that wedding feast, they could have said, you know what? One day I'm not going to sleep. Let me go to the dealers. Let me get some oil. They had enough time for preparation, but they were not prepared. So what is Jesus ultimately teaching his disciples at that time? So Jesus is telling his disciples that because of this parable, there is going to be a delay. He's going to come. There is going to be a delay. And he's going to come suddenly, but they are supposed to watch because they don't know when is the hour going to come. What does this word watch mean? The Greek word for the word watch is gregoreo. It means to be on the alert, to stay awake. It's a constant state of readiness. Was he saying that they're not to sleep? But you see in the parable, the wise virgins themselves get drowsy and they're sleeping, right? They're not reprimanded for it. That's not what Jesus meant when he was saying, watch. But let us dig a little more deeper into his whole Olivet discourse to see what he actually means. Before telling the parables, Jesus actually tells them a few things. He tells them that false Christs are going to come and they're going to convince people that they are the Christ and for their own selfish gains, and they will lead them astray. He tells them that they will see horrible things happen in Jerusalem, things that he cannot describe. He also tells them that they will hear unsettling news of wars, famines, and earthquakes that will put fear in the hearts of people. He tells them that they themselves will face persecution that will test their faith to the core. At the same time, life is going to go on. He gives an example of the story of Noah to tell them that just as in the days of Noah, before the flood came, people were marrying and given in marriage. People were eating and drinking. The evil were getting prosperous. The wicked were saying there was no God, and everything was going well. This was going to shake the disciples' faith. This was going to discourage them. And he was going to tell them that there is a delay. And eventually he's going to tell them the hardest truth of all, that he was going to die. And remember what happens the night he died? All the disciples except one, they abandon him and they run. They fear for their life. You see, that's the context. In that context, Jesus tells them, watch. In a situation where their faith is going to be shaken, Jesus tells them, watch. When they are going to be discouraged, when they are going to feel drowsy and fall asleep, Jesus tells them, stay awake. So what does Jesus give them? He's actually giving them a tool for spiritual warfare. He's actually giving them a mindset of being constantly ready. Later on, Jesus himself would model that what it means to watch. As he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, just hours before he was going to die, he takes 3 of his disciples and he tells them, come, watch with me and pray with me. Matthew chapter 26, verse 38 to 41. We see the drama unfold. Jesus tells them in verse 38, he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful. He was actually anticipating the punishment, the suffering, and all the things that are going to happen. And in fact, Jesus was not even worried too much about his physical agony. He was actually thinking about all the sin of the entire world to be placed upon him, and that the Father will actually look away from him. And he was filled with sorrow. And you know what he said? My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me. And he goes a little further. He falls on his knees and he prays. Isn't that awesome? Earlier we saw Satana share something that, we cannot produce what we don't model, right? And Jesus here is modeling it for them. He doesn't just say, watch, okay? You watch. I'm going to go. No, he actually models it for them. They've seen it throughout Jesus' ministry. Every morning he would go. He would just disappear from the crowds and he would watch. He isn't asking us to do something which he himself isn't going to do. Verse 39, and going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, so could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. So in that watching, Jesus fights the temptation to abandon God's plan for rescuing the whole world. He fights that temptation. In that watching, he gets the strength to obey God the Father. In that watching, he is actually able to surrender all of him to God and say, God, you know the best. Why don't you do what is best? I will surrender. You see, watching is not about getting extra credit. Some of you may be thinking, hey, watching is for those who are super spiritual. But Jesus is saying there is no middle ground. You're either in or you're out. And the ones who are in, he expects them to watch. So what is the application for us today? We saw that watching is a tool for spiritual warfare, and watching is a mindset. So what does it mean to us today? At the beginning I said the parable isn't popular anymore. Can you imagine why? We live in a day and age where it's been 2,000 years. Slowly as the excitement about Jesus' coming is gone, people are becoming more prosperous. We are more prosperous, at least from the medieval ages. We are so busy doing our work. I bet it's because we probably have forgotten. We probably have given up. And preachers and Christians nowadays are focusing on the here and now. You know what? Let's just make sure we're doing good church. Make sure we're doing good religion, make sure we're growing because, the business model, right? What does this mean to us today? There's a message for all of us. First of all, it reminds us that even though there is a delay, Jesus is coming for sure. It gives us great hope. Even though things are going to be bad, even though things are going to be scary, they're discouraging, they will shake your faith, I am going to come back. I am the bridegroom. There is going to be a feast. But it also gives us a warning that a lot of people sitting here in church, thinking that they're in, will find themselves to be out. They think they have a lamp. They think they're ready, but unfortunately, they're not prepared. You see, it's not my job to make you feel convicted. It is the job of the Holy Spirit. And I hope that you take some moments to introspect as we go through the rest of the passage and sermon. But I have to ask you, are you truly prepared? Or are you thinking, that it's okay? Sometimes we have generational Christians in the church, right? There's a saying in my church back in India that you hatch, match, and dispatch in the church. You're born in the church, you're dedicated, you are matched in the church, your wedding happens here, and finally a time comes when time for you to be dispatched, and you go from the church, you're buried in the church cemetery, right? You have your epitaph, and you're good to go. I have finished my journey, some of these epitaphs say, and you're thinking, that's it. That's your lamp? Is that your lamp? But does it have any oil? This lamp isn't going to save you. Jesus was actually not talking about people, 2,000 years ago. In fact, he was, but his direct reference was to the scribes and Pharisees. If you knew the great lengths that a Pharisee would go to obey God's law, in fact, they actually made up so many additional laws that they were so careful not to break any of the law of God. But unfortunately, they had become hypocritical. It was all in the mind and nothing in the heart. And they, thinking they were going towards God, in fact, made themselves God. Are you in that category? Is that your lamp today? You see, there is no in and out in heaven. It's either in or out. Sorry for those who like in and out. But you may be saying, where is his coming? Jesus hasn't come. You guys have been telling that Jesus is coming from 2,000 years. He hasn't come. What is he doing? Does he need some extra time or something? But this same disciple, Peter, later on, actually not Peter, in Hebrews it says 3 verses 12 to 15. The Bible gives us some encouragement. Take care, brothers, lest there be in any of you unbelieving evil heart leading you to fall away from the living God. But exhort one another every day, as long as it's called today, that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. For we have come to share in Christ, if indeed we hold our original confidence firm to the end, as it is said, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts, as in the rebellion. Jesus is telling them that they need to watch because the sin nature that we are born with, it is so deceitful, it's going to convince you that everything is okay. It's going to convince you that's your churchiosity, that you call your religiosity, that, weekly you go to church and that's good enough. But whereas Jesus is actually looking at a change in the heart. Long time ago, I was in the same place too. I was a school kid. I was, very popular in my church. I had good memory power. I have no idea what happened to that now, but I was really good, and all my Sunday school teachers liked me. But God knew I had a different mask at church, and I had a completely different mask at my school. In fact, I was the one who introduced some of my friends to some really bad things, and God knew that, and He saw that. And I realized, sitting in a vacation Bible school in April 1995, that, God, I'm not prepared. I thought I was okay, at least I was doing enough good, to balance out the bad, right? I had enough oil in my lamp, but I realized I wasn't prepared. The only solution was to ask God to prepare me. That's the clue. We don't have a righteousness of our own. And Jesus isn't telling us, by watching, I want you guys to do enough good works so that you can be prepared. In fact, he invites us and he says, you guys cannot do it. Let me clothe you with my righteousness. I'm not some God in some temple saying, clean yourself and come to me. I'm the God who has shed my blood to clean you when you come to me. I'm not sitting somewhere in the hills saying, you come to me and you do this, this, this. He's saying, I have done the climbing. I want just you to be with me. Believe in me. If not one day, where is your spiritual journey? If you haven't believed in this Jesus, one day is going to come, and on that day there will be a cry of desperation, Lord, Lord, open to us. To illustrate this desperation, here is a small example. There's an excerpt from Tom Wolfe's amazing book, The Right Stuff. This tells the story of an American space program which started out as an outgrowth of the Air Force test pilot program at Edwards Air Force Base. This was in the 1950s. Okay? So they were test pilots, and they were called to do an American space program, some testing for them. And these pilots would test new planes, and some of which worked well, and some of it didn't. For a sobering frame of reference, just in 1952 alone, 62 Air Force pilots were killed in 36 weeks of training. Here's Wolfe. In those planes, which were like chimneys with razor blade wings on them, you had to be afraid to panic. And that phrase was no joke. In the skids, the tumbles, the spins, there was truly one thing you could let yourself think about: what do I do next? Sometimes at Edwards Air Base, they used to play the tapes of pilots going into their final dive, the one that would eventually kill them. They had their tapes. And the man would be tumbling, going end to end, and in a 15-ton length of pipe with all the aerodynamics long gone and not one prayer left, and he knew it. He would be screaming into the microphone, but not for Mother or for God or the nameless spirit of Ahor, but for one last hopeless crumb of information. I've tried A, I've tried B, I've tried C, I've tried D. Tell me, what else can I try? This is a pilot, nose diving, about to crash. And that's their cry of desperation. And then the truly spooky click on the machine as they were watching, and they turned it off. And everybody around the table would look at one another and nod ever so slightly. And the unspoken message was, too bad, that was a man with the right stuff. This is the foolish bridesmaids, and this is us. Are you going to Jesus for preparation? Or are you thinking, I have my lamp, it's enough for me? And when you have to scramble, you're like, okay, can you give me some oil? Okay, where do we go? Are you scrambling? Are you saying, I've tried A, I've tried B, I've tried C, I've tried D. What else should I do? Where can I find the oil? You see, on that day, after all these opportunities that God is going to give, we are told that there is not going to be an additional opportunity. And just like those early test pilots at Edwards Air Force Base, we're screaming into that microphone right up until we plow into the ground. We miss the bridegroom's arrival because we had our heads buried in our control panel trying to save ourselves. The other pilots thought it was the sign of the right stuff. In fact, the book, The Right Stuff, talks about how these pilots did the right thing of, trying everything. And so it would inform the other pilots. But unfortunately, that was not the right thing. These pilots, they never came out alive. This kind of stuff only ever ends up in smoking craters in the ground, as that picture showed. If you have been coming to church but you don't have a personal relationship with Jesus? And God, you're thinking, I have a relationship with God. I have to ask you, what is your lamp? It's not enough to say, I know God. You actually have to figure out, will God say, I know him savingly? Can God say that about you? And secondly, we come to the believer. If you are one of the wise ones who've been watching, Jesus still commands us to use this tool of spiritual warfare, because watching is the only pathway to living a life pleasing to God. There will be a lot that won't make sense in this world. In fact, just as in the days of Noah, the life will go on, but not forever. Temporarily you will see that people are prospering, and you might be tempted to think, gosh, why am I wasting my time? Shouldn't I be focusing on this? Shouldn't I be focusing on that? There would be a lot of discouragements. Some of you would, go through suffering. Some of you would lose some friends, loved ones. But God is saying, take heart. You're not going to go in this alone. I'm going to be with you. And God encourages us that one day Jesus will come and he will make all things right. Don't be discouraged that nothing is happening, or don't doubt the promise of God. So Peter, who was listening to the Olivet Discourse, would later tell his own listeners in 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 9 to 10, the Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. Instead, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. That is the heart of God. You see, you may be thinking, God is delaying it. Is he there or not? In fact, God is saying, I really want everybody in this world to come to know me. That is his heart. That is our hope. And on that day, he will call us wise and faithful servants. Matthew chapter 24, he says, come and share in your master's happiness. You get to share in that great feast. There is true joy, peace, happiness, and fulfillment in that place, and Jesus wants to share with you. So take heart. And finally, like I said, there is a message for everybody. There's a message for people who do not have any faith in God as well. And I want to ask you, what is your lamp? Because we're all holding a lamp. The lamp represents what we are hanging on to. It represents what we have set our hopes on. It could be success. It could be corporate success, especially in the Bay Area, the innovation, the next big startup, going IPO and things like that. It could be a certain thrill, an activity, a hobby that you pour yourself into. It could be materialism, that stuff will make you happy. It could be pleasure and satisfying all the desires of our eyes and our body. Or it could be escapism, killing all your desire and living away from community. In fact, it could even be your own family. What is your lamp? What have you set your hope on? See, whatever you have set your hope on, whatever your lamp is, I want to ask you, how is it working out for you? How is it working out? You see, no matter what the lamp is, one day will come when the lamp won't light up. You will try to light it up, it won't light up. And you could be chasing success, and one day you might be able to find that there's emptiness after all. You could be chasing a thrill, and one day you might find, man, this is exhausting. It's a never-ending pursuit. What will you do then? Will you be prepared? As I read the Bible, I believe that it teaches us that all, no matter who you are, you could be, a church-going Christian, you could be truly a believer, or maybe you don't believe God, that all have committed sin, and one day we will face judgment. There is a verse in the Bible which says, Mark chapter 8, verse 36, for what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his own soul? What will you do about it? But I also believe that for all who come to Jesus, no matter how worse or how bad you are, there is forgiveness of sin. There is hope, and there is enough oil for everybody. There is no in and out. There is only in or out. And let me conclude by quoting Matthew chapter 24, verse 46 to 41. Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly, I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. Thank you.